sarcomere. Remember, the sarcomere is from Z line to Z line. The titin holds the myosin, the thick filaments, from going wonky, and the thin filament and the thick filament slide past each other in the sliding filament model, and contraction has happened. As the sarcomeres shorten, the muscles pull together, and this makes the tension. The muscles shorten, maybe from both ends, maybe from one end, and this will be determined by how the muscle organ is attached. And we're going to go over that more in our next chapter. Relaxation is passive. It does not require energy. The relaxation comes after the contraction. The contraction may last longer or less depending on the neural stimulus, the number of free calcium available in the sarcasm, that is, in the sarcoplasm, and the availability of adenosine triphosphate. The calcium concentrations fall, the calcium detaches from the troponin, and the active sites are recovered by tropomyosin. So the muscle has relaxed. It took no energy. It was a passive event. What is rigor mortis? This is a fixed muscular contraction after death. The ion pumps are not working anymore. The ATP is used up. Calcium is built up in the sarcoplasm. And that's the end. Rigor mortis. Summary again. They shorten, the muscle fibers shorten as the thin filaments slide between the thick filaments. The free calcium in the sarcoplasm will trigger a concentration. The sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium ions when a motor neuron stimulates the muscle fiber. The contraction is an active process, and relaxation and return to resting length, those are passive. I thought this was a great review. Tension as a whole, a muscle fiber is either contracted or relaxed, like we mentioned before. This is going to depend on the number of pivoting cross bridges, the fiber's resting length when it was stimulated, and the frequency of the stimulation. So if the stimulation is very, 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 very frequent, then it can build up and cause the shortening, summation, and then shortening. So there's a stimulus and another stimulus and another stimulus, not a whole lot. A wave summation is more and more, greater and greater stimulation over time. And then incomplete tetanus, this is when the stimulus frequency increases and increases, and the periods of relaxation are very brief. Complete tetanus, this is when the frequency is so high that the relaxation phase is completely eliminated. Tension plateaus at maximum levels. There is no break. Again, tension in skeletal muscles are going to depend on the internal tension produced by the muscle fibers, the external tension exerted by muscle fibers on the elastic extracellular fibers, and then the total number of fibers stimulated. So if a stimulation is above a certain threshold, the fiber will contract. If it is below that threshold, the fiber does not contract. A motor unit in a skeletal muscle, it might contain hundreds of muscle fibers connected to the same single motor neuron. Recruitment, this is in a whole muscle or a group of muscles. Smooth motion, increasing tension. These are produced by slowly increasing the size or number of the motor units stimulated. The maximum tension is when all the motor units reach tetanus. This can only be sustained for a very short time, and then there will be muscle fatigue. An example of a motor neuron coming from the spinal cord, it might innervate hundreds of fibers, but no fiber will be attached to more than one neuron. This slice of the spinal cord is about the size of a dime. Sustained tension, if it's not maximum tension, then the motor units are going to take turns resting and being excited. And this way you can hold your cup of coffee for hours and you're still okay. You haven't reached muscle fatigue. The normal tension and firmness of a muscle at rest is muscle tone, and these muscle units actively maintain body position even though there's no motion occurring. If a person has higher muscle tone, say when they're asleep, they're going to use more calories per day or more energy than a person whose muscles are weak and flaccid at rest and at rest. Isotonic contractions, these are contractions that shorten the muscle. Isometric contractions, this same metric measure is as though we put our hand under the table and lift up, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up, and the table does not move. So the muscle has not shortened, but it did become tense. The muscle has become tense, but it's not shortening. Isometric. And these are examples of isotonic and isometric contractions. Muscle relaxation, the return to resting length. There will be elastic forces. The elastic elements, tendons and ligaments, they expand the sarcomeres to resting length. There are opposing muscle contractions that are reverse of the direction of the original motion, and these skeletal muscles work to help us with coordination and help us get back to a homeostasis resting state. Gravity can take the place of opposing muscle contraction to return a muscle to its resting state. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and this is going to provide energy for muscle contraction. There's an adenosine, and then there's a sugar with 3 phosphates attached, and this is the way they're organized. The third phosphate will, when energy is needed, will be released, and the energy that held it to the second phosphate, there's a significant amount of energy there. That energy then is made available for metabolic processes, and then the body's going to take that adenosine diphosphate, ADP, and make it back into adenosine triphosphate by putting more energy between that second phosphate and then attaching with that energy the third phosphate. So that energy then is ready. Then there's ATP for the next time that energy is needed, stored between the second and the third phosphate. Creatine phosphate is the storage molecule for excess ATP energy when the muscle is at rest. The energy recharges ADP to ATP, like we just mentioned, and it's going to use the enzyme creatine kinase, or CK. When the CP is used up, other mechanisms generate ATP, and we're going to talk about those after a while. Two types of metabolism, aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic is when fatty acids in the mitochondria, they are the primary energy source of resting muscles. They break down fatty acids and produce, you want to remember, they produce 34 ATP molecules per glucose molecule. Anaerobic or without air in the cytoplasm is the primary energy source for peak muscular activity. So aerobic, mitochondrial, anaerobic, this is occurring in the cytoplasm. It's the primary energy for peak muscular activity. Produces only 2 ATP molecules per molecule of glucose, and it breaks down glucose from glycogen stored in the skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles at rest metabolize fatty acids and store glycogen. During light activity, the muscles generate ATP through anaerobic breakdown of carbohydrates, lipids, and amino acids. At peak activity, energy is provided by anaerobic reactions that generate lactic acid as a byproduct. A couple of things to keep in mind. One is when the body needs energy, it can use protein to break down to use as energy. It prefers glucose or, fats, sugars or fats, but it can use protein for energy. The body cannot use energy for protein when the body needs protein. Also, lactic acid, that buildup of lactic acid is what makes the muscles feel sore. So if you've been working out and then you feel sore afterward, it's due to the lactic acid. Muscle fatigue. When they can't perform the required activity any longer, they are fatigued. Maybe it's because the metabolic reserves are depleted. Maybe the sarcolemma and the sarcoplasmic reticulum have become damaged. Maybe because of that buildup of lactic acid that causes the soreness has also caused too low of a pH for the muscle to function well. And lastly, muscle exhaustion and pain can also cause muscle fatigue. There is a recovery period. The oxygen needs to become available and the mitochondrial activity needs to be resumed. So here we have the removal and recycling of lactic acid by the liver, and this converts it to pyruvate, and then glucose is released to recharge muscle glycogen reserves. The oxygen debt after the exercise. When you work out or you've been running, then you breathe heavily for a while until that oxygen debt is repaid, and then you go back to a normal breathing pattern. This is sometimes caused excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, which it's really needed, so I don't know that it would be considered excess, but that's what the name of it is, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC. The muscles are useful for producing heat. They generate heat. Muscles produce heat, and up to 70% of the muscle energy can be lost as heat rather than movement. And this raises the body temperature. You notice that when you get up on a very chilly morning, and then after you get moving around a bit or working out, you become very warm. Hormones and muscle metabolism. Hormones that influence muscle growth and muscle maintenance. Both are growth hormone, testosterone, thyroid hormones, and epinephrine. Testosterone is something that some men will take to try to prevent muscle loss and perhaps try to gain some muscle, especially in their years where testosterone has lowered. Their available testosterone is much lower later in life. Thyroid hormones, the thyroid helps keep everything going in your body, and if your thyroid hormones are low, everything is going to be more frail. You will have less muscle, less everything else as well. Epinephrine also. Muscle performance is through force or endurance. Both of them. Force is the amount of tension produced, and endurance, how long can that tension continue? This is going to depend on what muscle fibers are being used and your physical conditioning. So a person in great physical condition is going to be able to have greater force for a longer endurance than someone who is, say, very sedentary. We have fast fibers, slow fibers, and intermediate fibers. Fast fibers, they're quick on, quick off. They don't have much. They can't keep going for a long time. Strong contractions, and they're gone. Slow fibers, these are slow to contract, slow to fatigue, and they're going to last a lot longer. They have more mitochondria in them, they have a higher oxygen supply, and they contain myoglobin. And myoglobin is the red pigment that binds oxygen. Intermediate fibers, halfway in between. Hypertrophy, think of the Incredible Hulk. He's been working out and taking some kind of something to make his muscles bulk up. Hyper, much trophy growth. So hypertrophy. Atrophy, that's the opposite of the Incredible Hulk. Maybe someone who is bedridden or someone who has been in a wheelchair for quite some time, and their muscles haven't been used much, and they shrink, become smaller, they sag, and they don't have much power. Another reason that elderly people will fall down, sometimes it's not osteoporosis, sometimes their bones are in good health, but they just have so much muscle atrophy that they can't continue walking when they thought they could, and a little bump or a little trip and they're on the floor. Okay, so we've been talking about skeletal muscle for this whole time. There are 3 types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth, and we're going to talk about cardiac muscle for about 3 slides here. Cardiac muscles are striated, just so are skeletal muscles. So cardiac muscles are striated, but these are the muscles that are found in the heart and only the heart. These cells are very small. Cardiac muscle cells are small. They only have 1 nucleus. They have short, wide T-tubules, no triads. They have the SR with no terminal cisternae. Well, they don't have triads. They are aerobic. They're high in myoglobin and mitochondria, and they have intercalated discs. Yes, it's aerobic, lots and lots of myoglobin and mitochondria, because that heart never stops. It just keeps beating and beating. Those intercalated discs, they're only found in heart muscle, only in cardiac muscle. They are specialized. They're contact points between the heart muscle cells. They join the cell membranes. They create the gap junction, or the desmosome, so to speak. They help with the physical structure and also electrical conduction, electrical connections between those cells. The intercalated discs link the heart cells mechanically so that the heart does beat similarly to just a large single fused mass of cells. And this can be attributed to the intercalated discs. Functional characteristics of cardiac muscle. Well, they beat by themselves. If you have heart cells and you have them in a petri dish, they will each beat on their own. But if they've been in that petri dish very long, pretty soon they will all be beating in unison. They communicate with each other, and they have automaticity, okay? They keep going on their own. They're also controlled by pacemaker cells, and they're also controlled by the nervous system. We'll get into that more when we get into the appropriate chapter with the heart and the vessels. Important to know, there is an extended contraction time with cardiac muscle cells. They're going to contract 10 times longer than skeletal muscle. So that extra long contraction time then in between those is an extra long refractory period. So that refractory period between the contractions prevents summation, prevents tetanic contractions by the cell membranes. You don't want the whole heart to just seize at once. So there's a long refractory period. Lastly, and we'll talk about the heart more later when we get to the heart chapter. But as far as muscles go, that's it. And lastly, we're going to talk about smooth muscle tissue. And the smooth muscle tissue is in several other systems. The erector pili muscle that we talked about in the integumentary system that caused the goosebumps, that is smooth muscle. Blood vessels and airways are smooth muscle, and when those blood vessels contract because of tension and stress, that increases the blood pressure of the person. That's not the only thing that affects blood pressure, just one aspect of blood pressure. And those blood vessels are made of smooth muscle tissue. Reproductive and glandular systems, we need the smooth muscle. Say in the outer third of the fallopian tube, an egg is fertilized. Something needs to help that fertilized egg get over into the uterus so that it can implant. Smooth muscle. Digestive and urinary systems, the digestive system has a lot of smooth muscle all through the intestinal tract, and peristalsis can be attributed to smooth muscle contraction. Pretty cool. Smooth muscle does not have striations. It is non-striated, and it's the only muscle that has no striations. It has a different internal organization. It does have actin and myosin, but it's put together differently and it contracts differently. That's because it has a different function. The characteristics of smooth muscle cells, they are long, slender, spindle-shaped, and you can see in those images. They have a single central nucleus. They were not fused together. They stayed single. They do not have T-tubules. They do not have myofibrils. They do not have sarcomeres. They have no tendons, no aponeuroses. They do have scattered myosin fibers, and the myosin fibers have more heads per thick filament, and there are thin filaments attached to dense bodies. Those dense bodies are only in smooth muscle tissue. There are no dense bodies in the other types of muscle, only smooth. Dense bodies transmit contractions from cell to cell, and you want to remember that. This is the end of the muscle tissue chapter, and the next chapter we'll talk about actual muscle organs, and we'll go over a few of these muscles. We'll talk about how they connect to the skeleton and why it matters. So please write down all your questions, email them to me, or somehow get your questions to me and I will answer them. I'll get back with you either in class or through an email. Have a great rest of your day. Happy studying.